Hello, everyone. If you're listening or watching this, you're either watching it previously recorded on YouTube or listening to it on our podcast. We had to make some hard edits tonight, and so if there's some jumps in content, please know that we're just trying to cancel out a couple of distracting side noises and make sure that you all don't hear those. And so again, if you're hearing some jumps, know that we're sorry, and have a great rest of the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Geek Spiel on Air. My name is Chris, aka Tiny Rhino, and we're here with a couple of folks tonight. The typicals, right? You got a couple of faces you're probably used to. Matt, say hello.
Hello, everyone. And the dog says hello.
Right,
the dog.
It sounds like you.
Jim, is that your dog?
That is my dog. She's being a goober, but
Hey.
her name's Riley.
Yeah.
She's obnoxious. I'll apologize in
He mimics
advance.
Matt perfectly.
Gil, say hello to everyone.
Hello there. How are you doing?
Good. And Gil, you look like you're traveling again.
I am still on the road. Yeah, 3
weeks
now.
Oh gosh.
Next week is my last trip, and then I'm home for at least 2 months. Yeah.
All right, that's nice. And we've got our guest on the show for tonight. Jim, say hello.
Hi there.
All right. So just so you all, I don't think I've prefaced this yet. Jim is a student at the University of Missouri, where I work. Jim approached me a couple of months ago about doing an independent research study. And that was actually kind of the fuel for tonight's conversation. And we'll get into the research study here in just a little bit. But I wanted to start us off tonight with just the intro that we typically do. So again, Geek Spiel on Air is a PG-13 stream where we're here to talk, live, and play board games. And anyone's welcome. We're here to create an environment where folks feel welcomed and they have a voice and they feel like they can jump in and have a good time, because that's what it's about, with folks who also want to have a good time. So meet new people and grow our knowledge of board games and all the things. So tonight's show in particular, we're going to talk about inclusivity and allyship within tabletop gaming. Kind of a topic I don't think that gets talked a lot about. One of the things I will mention visually, for folks that are on the podcast, we are 4 white dudes talking about inclusivity and allyship, and so clearly we understand that this is from a very our voices, our experiences are from a very privileged lens tonight. But I think that the way we're going to take this conversation is hopefully just not us just mansplaining all over the place, and hopefully is at least kind of provides an opportunity for us to start a conversation, to continue a conversation that I think is that's needed within the industry. So I guess the first question is there an issue, right, within tabletop gaming? So that's, again, not just the RPG world, but board game world as well. We'll start with Matt or Gil. Do you feel like there's a conversation needed to be had around inclusivity and diversity in tabletop gaming?
I think there is. I think there's a problem with it in society, and I wouldn't see why around the gaming table is any different than the bigger picture that there is in society. So, I mean, you kind of set it up right. This is, we're 4 white dudes with our privilege all over us with regards to this issue. And you're not going to hear a lot of me telling you all about my stories and the things that I've been impacted in this way in the last 20 years of gaming. But I am really interested to talk to the two of you who have, some formal education in the background and some awareness of this, because I want to take this conversation and make myself more aware and more understanding of the situation, so I can see it. So I can, we all say, why didn't I say something? Why didn't I just put that guy in his place when this happened? Why didn't I step up? Or why didn't I speak up? And I think moving towards that, it all starts with education. So this is something that I haven't got a lot of hands-on experience with in the past. Probably either I'm blessed with the folks I've gamed with over the years, or I'm naive. Either way, I'm going to learn something here tonight.
Gil, what are you thinking?
I think my thoughts are similar to Matt. I do, being white, I still do have some experience of being a foreigner. So there are sometimes people confusing bad English with being dumb and stupid. Now, I am dumb and stupid, but has nothing to do with my language barrier. So I think that what Matt said is pretty on point. I think it's a society in general. It's not a board game or a particular hobby issue. I think it's an issue that we face as society in general. And that spills in everywhere, including board games. I mean, I think it's getting more and more inclusive, but percentagely it's very, very small. I normally remember all the people in the hobby that are either from different ethnical background or that are not men, because there are not that many, you know. So it shows me that I remember them mostly because of they're not that many. Because I meet a lot of people, and you know, you go to conventions and stuff like that. But I think it's getting better. I think there are people with a lot of influence on media and on YouTube and stuff like that that are kind of taking steps toward this. I'm happy to see some big names on board game media taking steps to, and I may name them throughout the show. I'm not gonna start naming now, but there are some people that has a lot of influence that are taking steps on board games toward that, and I know from inner circles how much backslash they're taking. You know, and not only men and women, but there's religion that get involved. You would be surprised what people says on chats. It's just, you know, it's crazy that people find themselves entitled to some of those things. So, yeah, but you know, it's conversations like that, and I think we as a channel, you know, should always be talking about and trying to reach out. But I think it's. We're doing the right thing. We're just not doing enough. That's, I think, my point.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely agree with, I think, the general conversation of inclusion and a lack of representation happens in all aspects of life. I'm gonna be the broken record there. But I do think that one of the important conversation pieces that I think we should always be having is, how do we make our spaces in particular like more impactful, more effective, more inclusive? Because that's going to be the big piece. Like that's what we're, I think, as allies, as people who have that privilege, able to control is in our spaces. And how do we, you know, be those, like Gil said, be those folks that are standing up and shouting out some influence. And Gil, I didn't mention this at first, and I'm glad that you brought it up. You know, as a non-native player to board games within the U.S., I think that you do have that kind of experience. I want to make sure that voice is included as well, because again, I think sometimes when we talk about inclusion, we typically as a society focus on gender and gender identity. When you talk about race and skin color, but we don't talk about other categories, right? Other reasons why as individuals we might be alienated or feel oppressed or undervalued. And I think one of the important conversations is, you know, what is it like when English, you know, may not be your second language, and not saying that's for you, Gil, but you know, or it's ability status, right? We're talking about someone who is a wheelchair user, and about our physical spaces, right? I mean, I haven't been to a board game con yet, but I know that one of the things that Jim and I will talk about here in a little bit, and we are getting a wonderful tour of Jim's house, is this conversation around you know, physical space. Like those cons are packed sometimes with booths and people, and when we talk about physical accessibility, sometimes that's, you know, also a barrier that we don't always talk about.
I
it
think
might
that is
prevent
actually,
someone from playing.
I think you're right. I think that's probably the most difficult part about this, is how to create safe environment that the people are not afraid to come to, right? It's not only to say, oh, we are like this, we want to do this, but people trust enough that they can come and feel like that. I think you're absolutely right.
Jim, let's
Yeah.
kick it off with our two conversations. I guess we'll alienate Matt and Gil for just a second.
Okay.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the premise of what inspired you to do your research or to start your research, and what is your research? What are you looking for? What's kind of the question you want to start answering?
Yeah. So the thing that really kind of got me looking into this topic of violence and harassment in con spaces and nerd spaces was actually when you did an event last fall about violence in kind of geek communities and geek TV shows, and talking about all of that. That kind of prompted this idea of, okay, so in this kind of amalgamation of geekdom that is Comic-Con, how does violence kind of play into that space? So that's what really kind of tipped it off. Then I kind of talked to you about it, and we got going with it. And really the biggest question to answer is just the violence that occurs in these spaces. Is it the same? Is it different? How is it different from violence outside of these spaces? And what can be done to address that? What are the kind of future directions of how we address that, and how it can kind of change in the future?
Yeah, for sure. I'll say a little bit of background. My work is I'm a violence, and when I talk violence, I'm talking power-based personal violence. So things like sexual assault, sexual harassment, intimate partner violence, dating violence, stalking, so on. And so my work is as a culture, as an institution, because I work at a college and university, is how do we create an environment where sexual violence and relationship violence doesn't exist? How do we stop that? And I think for so often we've had that conversation that's focused on the victim or survivor, which is problematic, right? I think as a society, I think this goes for tabletop RPGs and tabletop board games as well, is that we look to folks with an oppressed voice to be their chief spokesperson, like speak up if you don't feel comfortable. And that's hard, right? We're placing a lot of emphasis on individuals who are experiencing violence to suddenly be comfortable and express that, hey, I'm being hurt. And so that's what I know my work is really focused on. And again, when Jim approached, I think the biggest piece that we did with our research was we wanted to just share those voices, right? I think we recognize that we are two people who have done a lot of research in this area, or in the sliver of this area. And but like our stories and voices aren't the ones that matter. It's we want to hear how this violence is playing out. We want to hear how does this violence impact individuals who want to do what we all want to do, which is enjoy this hobby of geek and nerddom. And I think tabletop gaming is a large part of that. I mean, I think that we need to start just having this conversation more often. I think this is an issue that lives in silence. And until folks with power, folks who navigate this space without worrying about some of these concerns, start talking about it, then we're not going to make folks feel super comfortable about being like, yeah, this is how I feel hurt when this happens.
Yeah, and I mean, how can you make someone feel comfortable to share these experiences around people who look just like and have the same identities as the people who have done this to them? So
yeah, sure.
That's another huge part of it.
So I think that leads us into the conversation, and I'll bring it back to the larger group. And I am seeing some questions in chat, so I'll get that here in a second. But I want to segue, I think, into an important spot is as individuals within this community, how do we create a safe environment at our tables, right? Like, how do we as players, how do we as folks that I think, at least in the spaces we dominate, right, have some privilege, and not just from like, our identities, but for Matt, Gil, and I, we've been gaming for, 10, 20 years. We've been playing for at least that long. And I think it's a privilege and a bit of power to have that level of knowledge and comfortability with those spaces. So how do we as individuals make our gaming tables safe for everyone? How do we make it an inclusive place for people to play?
I'll go first. I think it comes down to two components that are both required, and that is awareness and bravery. You have to be aware that it's going on. You have to be able to think with empathy for the others or sympathy for the others, and to be situationally aware, and then be brave enough to do something about it. So I think that's probably true no matter if you're at the gaming table or at the line in the grocery store. When you see those kind of things happening, you have to speak up and take action. And it doesn't always have to be, take somebody by the throat and throw them out the door because they're being that way. But if you start with not letting the small things slide, if you start with setting a boundary of things that are okay and not okay to talk about, or ways to act, and then you kind of go from there. I do it with my kid. I've got a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old, and when they say things that are inappropriate, I correct them. Why wouldn't I extend that to my gaming table? I guess that, there's all kind. I want these people to like me. These are friends that I want to continue to have. So maybe I would be more tolerant of it. I think the opposite is true. I think if I want to keep and make friends, being less tolerant and being more aware of that is the way I'd have to go. Like I said, it's sometimes it's easy in hindsight to see those things. In fact, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, I saw a Twitter post and someone had listed a whole bunch of words that were offensive for certain reasons. And when I went down through those, I thought, those are words I use all the time. And until you put it in the context that was, I never realized that. I thought, boy, that is certainly something that I need to take out of my vocabulary. And I can only do that starting with awareness.
Yeah, I would definitely hop on that. I think, with awareness comes self-education, right? It's not just that we need to be aware, as we need to educate ourselves what that looks like, right? And so I think a lot of that is just talking out and, having these conversations more. But one of the things I want to harp on for the work that I do, Matt, and I think you brought up is, having that courage to say something. There are a lot of barriers. There are reasons why, and you mentioned this, like, we want people, this is hopefully a stress relief for many of us, right? It's a conversation that, or a hobby that lets us express ourselves. One of the conversations Jim and I had is, geek and nerddom, right, is already for kind of a community of folks who never felt like they had a place. And so, I think there might be some barriers for us wanting to isolate ourselves and call out some of this behavior. There are barriers, there are reasons why we don't want to do things, but I think there are ways for us as a community to still say something and do something. It doesn't always have to call, like Matt said, it doesn't have to be like you throw someone out of a table. It doesn't have to be that you directly confront them, but can you, distract them from the conversation? Can you pull them aside later on? It doesn't have to be this big confrontation, right? Can you get someone else to, if Gil and I are playing in a group and Matt starts saying something really messed up and I go to Gil afterwards and I was like, hey, that, really made me feel uncomfortable, and Gil feels good about stepping in and saying something, I don't think there's anything wrong with letting Gil take the lead there. If Gil feels comfortable with that. So, yes, there are all these barriers, these reasons why we might not want to step in, but we can do something. There's always something I think that we as individuals, as players, can do and say, and to make folks feel comfortable. So
I think
Go ahead.
Go? Okay.
Go ahead, Jim.
I think going off of that, kind of with the awareness note, something that is interesting with our research is we did these interviews with people who have experienced this, and by doing this, we're kind of documenting things that have happened, and these are things that, with this documentation, can be noticed. And that said, it walks this fine line of self-education and hearing from marginalized voices and being educated by marginalized voices, which is not something that we want to base all of our education on. So I think, the awareness and the self-education is definitely a key point there.
without
And
putting
also,
that pressure on those marginalized
yeah,
voices to educate us on
exactly.
everything, right?
Exactly. I think also with ways to kind of intervene there. One thing that came up when we were having those conversations at the con was two people who had experienced a D&D game where they felt completely ignored and isolated by the person who was kind of managing the game. And I think that's something where gamers can kind of step in, whether they're managing the game or just playing the game with people who are being excluded, to actively say, oh, what are your thoughts? How do you want to take this campaign? How do you want to go from here? So I think that's another great step in the right direction.
Right. And it's not super confrontational either. How easy is it to
Mhm.
say, Matt, you're the rogue of the party. How would you get past this super sneaky situation? It's again low confrontation. It's just saying, what are your ideas? And I think that's a great piece. Gil, you were hopping in there for a second, and you were
No,
gonna say,
I was just like about you said, like people when you have groups, it's very delicate, very difficult. I'm lucky to be in groups that I think are good mix and very acceptance. Like I told you the story about the D&D when I decided to join a D&D group. There was no lack of people inviting me and made me feel comfortable. Somebody who had no experience on D&D. But it's also sometimes when we decide to open a game group in an area, we're so focused on just get people in, and we need to ask ourselves, am I prepared to lead a game group? I'm just excited, but do I thought through the consequences of leading that group? Because you have to make sure that you are able to step in on situations that are delicate. Because when you're spearhead something, you were responsible for that thing. And many times I think we just do something and don't take responsibility for it. And little things can become big things. And I think we have to always think through that when we decide to do events and getting game groups together. There was a thing very important. Lord Andrews said something on the chat. It's gone by now, but there's no denial that play board games, different kind of board games, there's some level of intelligence or skills or whatever you want to call it to play a lot of board games. But it's important for us to be inclusive when people that are not fasting or picking up things. How do we deal with that? And when he said that, I was like, I know there was a guy I didn't want to play anymore because every time I want to play with him, it's like takes an hour just to teach the game and stuff like this. How do we react to that? At which point is being exclusive and which point is just being pragmatic? So it's not an easy topic because there is no line anywhere that says, okay, here's the red line.
right.
You have to stop right there. Don't cross that. It's just what you said in the beginning. Sometimes we think about this as race, gender, religion, but it's so much more. It's impediment that a lot of people have, that sometimes gets mistaken. I made a joke in the beginning, but sometimes somebody has problem stuttering when talking, and people mix this with not being intelligent, and those things has nothing to do with each other. And small things like that is so hard because of centuries or whatever long being of culture or inheritance that we got, that we never learned to do that. And I think we always think, oh, this is too hard, and we cannot only change us. Like I have a kid, and the only way I'm going to be able to change things is to make sure that since I didn't have that, I need to make sure my kid do that. So we can like change one thing at a time. So I need to work on future generations. If I think it's just about me, and I don't try to influence, I know people says you shouldn't influence other people. It's just the opposite. I think you should influence other people for good. And I think if I don't teach my daughter that race, religion, and those things should not influence how she feel about people on first meetings. There's no hope. Like there's no hope if the future generation don't pick up the slack.
And you said it really kind of eloquently there, Gil, and that is you got to lead by example, and because you want to lead your daughter by example, because that's the only way she's going to learn those kind of things, or you want her to learn those kind of things from you. But at the gaming table, we can lead by example too, right? You know, if the person sits down and they've got a speech impediment or they've got an accent, or maybe they sat down at a table at a con and they didn't realize how heavy the game is, and that isn't, you know, you've got to, if there's 5 of you at the table and a 6th person sits down and it's the 5 of us that have been gaming together for years, we're going to be telling inside jokes and having a good time, and that is going to impact, you know, if we don't show tolerance towards teaching this new person how to play that game. If one of us steps up and says, you know what I mean, and can lead the rest of the group by example, and kind of bend that. So that's how I would teach the people at the gaming table similarly.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing point. And I think that leads me to a question of, you know, what expectations do you all set at your game? And I loved Gil's point. I think that, you know, when we talk about gaming dynamics, right? And, you know, you play your in-person group or even your online groups, right? You've got folks who I think kind of take the lead, because you kind of need sometimes, in my opinion, an organizer, especially, I mean, inherently with an RPGs, you have a dungeon master, and a GM or a DM, right? Like you have these folks that kind of inherently take the lead. I think it's amazing that those folks, and I think it needs to be that those folks have some level of responsibility to kind of shape and center, you know, in a supportive, fun, inclusive gaming environment at the core of the group. But what expectations do you set? Like, what are some ones that, when you all are at the table, you make sure happen, as, you know, again, organizers or folks who've been gaming for some time?
You know, I don't think you never have an open conversation about that. At least I haven't. But and what I've kind of gotten from this topic already tonight is sometimes it's easy. The misogyny is easy to see when someone's being inappropriate. The racism is easy to see because society has trained me to be more aware of that here in recent years. I think the inclusivity is harder to see if you're not keenly aware of it. So I don't know if having an open conversation as you sit down is probably how I would handle it. But maybe if I saw things going the wrong way, you know, I play a lot of board games with Cub Scouts. So there's a lot of 10-year-olds sitting around trying to learn a complex game. And, you know, it can turn Lord of the Flies pretty quick with 10-year-olds that are all, you know, jacked up on Kool-Aid and stuff. So I will, you know, so I guess situationally you have to kind of identify that and have that conversation. But I don't know. What do you suggest as the professionals?
Well, I just want to say how that's a wonderful imagery as a bunch of Cub Scouts going Lord of the Flies on each other, jacked up on, you said Kool-Aid, but I think back to Talladega Nights, it's like jacked up a Mountain Dew.
Mountain Dew,
yeah.
You know, I think that, and this is something I did for my in-person game, is I agree with you. I don't think the first time I sit down at the board game, I'm not going, now Gil, I just want you to know that these are my expectations. And I think a lot of that initially is kind of role modeling. And again, once you start feeling comfortable with the group, but at some point, I think the conversation needs to be had. And we did the same thing with our tabletop RPG group, the D&D group we have in person, where we kind of realized that one week a thing got said and folks weren't super okay with it. And so the next week we all kind of just, you know, a couple of us chatted online and said, okay, like, yep, that felt uncomfortable. Not that we want to have the conversation without everyone, but, you know, should we have the conversation? And I think we got to a consensus that we did. And, you know, it took some bravery to have the conversation, but us just going out there and saying, hey, I think I think someone offended someone. You know, and what do we do about that? And how do we make that conversation, you know, that space more inclusive? What about that experience was hard for, just doing a check-in. And I think from then we did kind of lay down some ground rules. We laid down some expectations, right? And not just like the, don't say this or don't do that. I think that there's some of that, but also ways of having, if we as someone who kind of observed someone saying something that we felt like was problematic or hurtful, what way as a group do we want to voice that opinion, right? And so we were really intentional about saying, like, we want to call it out. And if you don't feel comfortable calling it out, take it to one of the folks who do feel comfortable calling it out. We just kind of created a process. Jenny's dog is got some stuff to say. No, you're fine. But I think for us, it was really intentional about having, again, the conversation about how do we communicate? How do we talk about it? I think so often we get weirded out by creating the ground rules, but I've also seen creating some ground rules be really effective in kind of squashing some of these issues in the first place, because we're having a conversation, right? It's all on the table from square one. So I don't know, Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, I think kind of establishing these community norms and space expectations at the very start of this game, of any game, any conversation, is a really good way to ensure that everyone feels comfortable calling out anything problematic that happens, and making sure that everyone feels comfortable in that space, comfortable with that group. I think it's a really nice conversation to kind of segue into really helping people feel comfortable in whatever game they're playing. I think, really just from the get-go, letting anyone in that group say what they want to see during that game is a really helpful way, especially when we're talking about kind of acknowledging and making sure that we're realizing that these, when we're not realizing it, a lot of times it's coming from a place of privilege, where we're not paying attention or not noticing the fact that these issues are issues to people who are in that party and at that table. So I think starting with those community expectations is a really helpful way to just get those issues on the table and make sure that everyone's aware of them, and then kind of go from there.
Okay.
Yeah, but those conversations can be tough. They can break groups very easily as well. Everything is so easy on theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes if you have a lot of people that are very strong-headed and very confrontational, you can get it's not I wish it was as easy as just sit down and talk about it, right?
True.
Not every time. Mainly the offender sometimes might not take that in stride. And then sometimes the offender is somebody who is polarized or leader or empathic to some groups. And you need to be, when you do this, you need to be prepared for the backslash too. Because sometimes we go like, let's make this nice. And then if things gets ugly, you need to sit down and say, okay, this might be the last time this group is getting together. We're going to do this because it has to be done. But you have to be prepared. Not always the consequences are, I want to use good with quotation in this term, right? Good as not what you're expecting. Yeah.
I think that even makes it more important, Gil, because if you have that strong personality in the room, you need to set expectations for them, right? So if you have that polarizing figure, having that conversation in the front is either going to make that person aware of that in a way to correct it, or it's going to make everyone else aware that, if this isn't for you or this isn't for me, we don't have to be a part of this. We can go, we can go do something else. Versus not having that and then getting blasted and being surprised by it after you've made a commitment to a group or something like that. But after listening to Chris and Jim here, I actually feel a little bit better about it, because when a couple of us set out to start Geek Spiel, it was really important that this was an inclusive environment. And I think I don't know if subconsciously or consciously, we're already kind of doing that, some of those things. And we every week we have a show, Table Crashers, and we have a guest on. And before we go on air, we have this little thing. Hey, just so you know, we all do this every week, and there's lots of jokes. If you don't get them, don't be afraid to ask, or if that kind of thing. So we're already kind of not as directly as I think maybe maybe it needs to be done, but we're already indirectly setting some of that up. I think, I'd hope.
Yeah. Well, and I think that a lot of folks think that this conversation's hard. And I agree with Gil. I think in a perfect world, we would all step in and there would be no barriers to anything and everything would be okay. But I think that one of the important things that kind of Matt's alluding to is I feel like we do is role model that initial environment we want to see. And I think that, yes, I guess back to our earlier point, yes, having a conversation is important, but sometimes you can set tones and messages by just role modeling the behavior you want to see too, right? So like, I think if you, this is an example I use in some of the education that I do. So, you know, at Mizzou, we have this chant that like is known by everyone. If someone were to, you know, shout out the letters M-I-Z, the call and response is Z-O-U. And I tell folks, like, how did you learn about that? Like, and you know, it's a chant that by your senior year, and I think Jim can attest to this, you know, you've heard it about, what, 10 million times?
Something like that.
Right. And so how do you know? Like, how do you know that's the thing to say? And so for someone who grew up around the college like myself, I was indoctrinated since birth, right? I was a small kid. We went to the sporting events, and that's chanted like for football, every, you know, American football anyways, every first down, it's M-I-Z-Z-O-U. Like we've known that since, or I've heard that since I was a kid. You know, when they come in and do summer orientation with new students, they're chanting that. You know, professors are putting that in emails, on slides for PowerPoint. You know, we have shirts at the college that just literally spell Mizzou over the front. And so I think that it's, you know, we can send messages without even necessarily drawing that to the forefront as a conversation. I think we send a message every week when, and I know that for some of you, you hear this opener and you're just kind of like, oh, okay, cool. It's just Chris saying it's a PG-13 stream. But I think that us saying every week that, you know, it's a PG-13 stream and that is important to us. Like, I think that is something that makes a big deal, and it shows that that's a value that we have and want to keep core to our packaging and our mission and vision as a stream. So I don't know, I think that's one of the things that I want to highlight, is that role modeling can be super important and doesn't have to be a big thing. And so if someone's looking for a low-key way to say or do something, they can do it as simple as just, you know, intervening or role modeling, excuse me.
Yeah, I agree with you. But it's important people to react to those kind of things before it breaks, right? Because it's much
True.
harder to mend it than, you know, trying to fix is always more difficult. So it is tough.
Yeah.
Before you move on, Chris.
Okay, that's exactly what I was about to do.
I know you were. There's a word I hadn't heard before, and that's allyship. That's a new one for me. Can you give me some context on that? I mean, I could probably put the compound word together and figure it out. But.
Right. I'll have Jim, because Jim does a lot of education on campus about diversity and inclusion work too. One of the things allyship for me means that you as an individual inherently have power and privilege. And how do you advocate and use that power and privilege to kind of create that inclusive environment? And one of the words that a friend of mine and a fellow educator uses often, and it's kind of a prominent piece in the field of prevention and education we do on a university level, is it's an active piece. Like, allyship is not something that I can just stamp on my forehead and say, I'm an ally, right? So like, I walk into a space and like, I have that label. Like, that's not how it works. For me, allyship is a very active process. It requires energy. It requires, you know, us to hop up there and say, you know, when we see something problematic, hey, that's not okay. You know, when we see someone who might not be included, hey, how do we add your voice to the conversation? And so I think that's something for me that's integral to that conversation is being an active ally, making sure that it's not just a noun or a title, but that it's a verb. It's something that you consciously perform and do. Jim, do you have
Yeah.
a conversation?
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll hop on that. So yeah, ally, like one of the big things that we say in the different organizations that I'm a part of is this idea that ally is not a noun, it's a verb, like Chris was saying, and that really your allyship is an active practice that doesn't end like doing. It's something that in this place of privilege, rather than saying this group needs this, I'm going to do this. You're listening to marginalized groups and doing what people need from you, not what you think people need from you, is another really important aspect of it. So I think that's, yeah, Chris summarized it really well. So definitely this idea of very active effort to fix these oppressions and these marginalization systems that are broken. And yeah, that's generally.
I like it. It sounds like it's a muscle that you need to exercise to make it stronger.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it's not something, again, I think folks get hearing this, definition and they go, oh God, that seems like a lot. I don't do that. But, again, I think the things we've talked about already are important ways to be an ally, is to educate yourself and be aware of the dynamics at play within, our spaces that we take up, role modeling behavior we want to see, talking about expectations. I think those are all ways, I think, to be a conscious ally. And so I don't know, it feels like it's one of those words that we throw out there, but then, that has this kind of like higher meaning, but it really all it is something we've been ingrained, or some of us anyways, have been ingrained and heard, since we've started, being part of groups and things like that. So one of the questions I did want to jump on was, when you have someone who is not living up to those expectations, as Digital Cartage put in chat, someone who's just being a jerk, how do you approach that? What do you do? Do you take it upon yourself to go out there and say, hey, that's not okay? Do you go take it to a group consensus? Like, what does that look like? Gil, you got a thought there?
I think that's the kind of a very individual dependent. I think it depends person to person. Everybody's so different. We're all different. We react to different. We see life different. We perceive right and wrong different. So hopefully that person at the minimum bare, that what kind of that particular individual is, and try to be proactive and reactive to that particular personality. I think that's the biggest problem with this whole issue that we're talking about. It's not one shoe fits all. It's not one size fits all. It's not one single solution. It's a collaborative, thing that has to be done by a group. Has many ways to approach it. Has many ways to perceive it. It's such a difficult topic because, again, it's part of who we grew up to be, our culture, what you see, what we're like from movies like that are whitewashed all the time, like beautiful Chinese pieces that want to turn into a movie. I love Matt Damon. It's a great actor, but why? It's just this kind of things that the society kind of push it to us every day, and I think it's so difficult to know how to react. And then the same thing when you're talking to other people is like how you react to that specific person, because some people are okay, or sometimes I don't know, that guy's pretty big. I fear for my physical, integrity, or there's so many variables. It's so hard. This is such a difficult topic. I wish I had an answer for you. That would be so awesome, but I don't know if I do. I just try my best and try to hear what other people do. People like you and Jim that have experience on the field. Try to learn from your experience because you have deal with those things. For me, that didn't have much experience on that, is I really don't know. I can say a bunch of stuff now, but I would just freeze when the moment comes, and that's my biggest fear. Just be the deer in the headlight when I should have not react. I see things. I'm so afraid of see something and not be brave enough to react to it. And that's something that bothers me the most on this whole issue.
Yeah, I know for me, one of the roles that I have on my campus, one of the orgs that I'm part of is diversity peer educators. So we just are a group of students who go across campus and do facilitations and presentations about inclusion, diversity, oppression, marginalization, etc. And one thing that definitely happens pretty regularly is someone says something that we need to address, something problematic that we need to address. And one of the most effective strategies for me in those situations, which obviously do vary somewhat with tabletop gaming, but one is kind of just ask the room their thoughts on the comment, and kind of use the room to address that issue. And then another is to just kind of keep things going, let myself have time to happen, and then address it after I've finished processing. So say I start with a question of what are your initial reactions to this facilitation that we just did, and someone says something problematic. I say, okay, anyone else have other thoughts? So that could be translated to anyone else have other thoughts of where we should go with this campaign? Talking about what do we all think a next move should be or something like that, to just kind of give that little time buffer of letting me figure out, okay, what happened? What should I say? How should I say it? Now let me say it. So that's something that's been very effective for me in that front.
Yeah, I would also say just in general, I think the role that when I take in our gaming groups is as that kind of organizational leader. And I think when I either get the sense that something kind of doesn't feel right, that someone's, being really hurtful or harmful with our words and kind of creating an unsafe space for folks, I kind of take it upon myself to just check in with not only the person that I believe, might have been hurt in that conversation, but also just, kind of, stepping in and saying, hey, person who said XYZ comment, did you think about how that might have come off? And I think one of the important pieces that I have often with folks is the conversation around impact versus intent, right? I think we as a society, oftentimes, there are some people out there who do intend to hurt other people, but I think a lot of folks are generally good natured. I don't think they really do intend for their words to have a negative impact on someone's life. But, really just being willing to say, hey, this is, I know what maybe something you intended, but did you recognize the impact that it has? Just because you didn't mean it that way doesn't mean it didn't still come off and have that drastic impact. So it's kind of an interesting kind of dynamic to throw in there is, recognize that, yes, you didn't mean to hurt anyone and you still did. And what does that mean? And so just a general point to throw out there as well. One thing that I will say here, I'm looking through the chat again, is, one of our folks kind of asked is, does allyship cause kind of the word used is weaker society? Acceptance is great and it leads to, progression, but it also kind of combats against this kind of comment around survival of the fittest. I gotta throw this out there because I think it's important to say is that when we think of kind of the tough skin comment, right? Like it's like, oh, it's just a joke. Like it's meant that way. Like, why did you take it so seriously? I think that's a really privileged statement for us to say. I think it's as individuals, like we have to put ourselves, or at least ask that person to kind of like, you know, be in their shoes a little bit, because yes, like again, I think it goes to that impact versus intent conversation. Yeah, we might not have meant harm, but it still hurt someone. And, you know, for me, that might not be a comment that kind of rubs me the wrong way, but for a lot of other folks, it might. So full disclosure here, and I share this with the work that I do. I'm a survivor of sexual assault. I was assaulted when I was 13 years old. And one of the things that we talk about within power-based personal violence work is how folks will use terms like rape to talk about within gaming communities, specifically about destroying or owning. Like, oh gosh, like I just got raped by that boss. And as someone who experienced rape, I'm not terribly a fan of that word. And I think a lot of folks think, well, that's just a joke and it's not meant to be harmful. But for me, someone who's had that experience, who's been harmed in a pretty drastic way, like, yeah, it does hurt. And while I feel comfortable with where I'm at in my life, being able to say, like, you know, this is back to that earlier conversation of, you know, telling folks what I'm okay with and what I'm not. That's one of the first things that I mentioned is, hey, just know that when you use rape in that way, like that is hurtful because I'm a survivor of assault. Like I just kind of throw it out there. And it's like, I know you didn't mean to hurt, but just know it does. And just bringing consciousness to that conversation. Now, again, I that's a privilege that I have to be able to bring that up. But I do think that it is an important conversation to have, is that what might be just seen as, you know, coddling to some folks really is a way of making folks feel like they can actually be a part of this conversation. I think some of the when Jim and I were doing our research, one of the things we talked about was around cosplay. And we had some folks who had like gender identity and gender expression, our society's interpretation of their expression didn't look the same, right? So they might identify as a trans individual or a gender nonconforming person. And when they were in cosplay, they would step out there and pick a character that kind of really fit with their identity. And what folks would do is then come at it and say, oh, well, like, you know, you're just being a gender bent version of this, you know, character, right? And I think one of the hard things that I heard, because I've done that before, right? I'm like, oh my gosh, you just did Soldier 76, which is an Overwatch character, and you know, that character presents as a male within the game, and you appear to me by society's very rudimentary, weird standards of feminine. So I'm just going to assume that you identify as a woman. You're creating a gender bent version of that. Like I've caught myself doing that. But for these folks, that it was really hurtful for them to say, no, I identify as a trans or queer individual. And for someone to say like, oh, you're just gender bending a character, like that hurt. And so being able to, I think, goes back to that kind of conversation about, you know, educating yourself, having that awareness, knowing that just because your intent might not have been hurtful, the impact still could be there. I think it's an important conversation to have. Sorry, I'll step off my soapbox for just a second. I apologize for that.
Well, I think as people get braver and become aware and start to have those conversations, there again, if someone makes a comment that is that you feel is unintentionally rude, you're going to say that very thing. Hey, you know, that I know you were trying to be funny, but that isn't really funny if someone has been assaulted. And you're going to see if that person goes, wow, you know what, I never really used that word, I'm sorry about that. Or if they buck up and say, you know, grow a pair. Funny's funny. It doesn't matter what you think. You know, it gives you the opportunity to make a decision about if you want that person to continue in the group that you associate with. You know, I mean, you can put a flag on the people that aren't going to be that are maybe this particular incident didn't affect the group in a big way, but you're on a road towards something. If someone is going to continue to say things that are intentionally, one of the things I tell my son when he's in fourth grade, kids come at him with different ideas, and one kid will be mean and another kid will be friendly and that kind of thing. I say, if they say something mean and you don't know, ask them, were you trying to be funny or were you trying to be mean? And their answer to that is going to tell you a lot of what you need to know. So I don't know. I think it's an opportunity to have, like you said, have that conversation or at least speak up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, something that I know I've talked about a lot is this idea that this inclusion is a choice. And when you ask someone that, you kind of figure out what choice they're making. And in those facilitations, something that we bring up a lot is this idea that people in that space, if they're going to be confrontational, they're making a choice to not pay attention, to just kind of take that whole facilitation for granted and not experience that education and not hear other perspectives. And yeah, I think that's a really easy thing to notice if you say, hey, what was your intention with that? And like Chris said, a lot of times people are going to say, oh yeah, no, I didn't mean that at all. And that'll just be a nice learning moment. But when you have someone who says, oh, come on, like, man up, it's fine, then you kind of see that side and you sort of have that crossroads of where do we go from here?
All right, so we're hitting up on our hour here. Gosh, there's so much more I wanted to talk about and all the things. I think we've all mentioned this. This is not an easy conversation. It's not always a conversation you can have in, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I think it's important to talk about, but it's deep, right? There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of depth to that conversation. But any last thoughts that anyone had, anything that they didn't get to say that they kind of want to hop in and chime in with real quick?
I'll go first. One thing is if you're trying to be more aware of inclusivity, specifically the new person sitting down at the table with four people that have been gaming together for years, you got to be cautious of overdoing it too. Someone might sit down at the table and you say, hey, you're the new guy here. Why don't you explain how to play this game? You can if you're trying to make them include them, make sure that you're including them in a way that's comfortable to them. Would be, I'm 44 years old. My inhibitions were 20 years ago. I'm a fat guy that'll take his shirt off at the beach. I don't care. But the person who sits down at the gaming table may not be that way. And especially when you go to conventions. Wow, that's a really neat game. I really want to play that. Can I sit in? And now a new person is sitting in at the table with three of you that came to the convention together.
Jim, what about you?
I think last thing for me is just we talked a little bit about allyship, and one thing that I know I threw out there was that allyship and kind of what those actions are is definitely defined by people who are experiencing oppression. And again, we're four white guys hanging out here having this conversation. So there's definitely self-education that we can do, and looking online at articles about how to be an ally to various groups. So I definitely would just say that any kind of actions that we could suggest are not the way to go unless you've done self-education that kind of that. So that'd be my note.
Okay. And I'm going to take my last note, and actually I'm going to quote a piece in chat that I think are really important here. And Wicked Gamer Dude said, I think overall, if you're part of a group, then the group mentality needs to be acceptance. If it's not, then it's a toxic group. Competition is good, but respect is important. And I do think that there's a lot. I mean, respect's a big word. There's a lot that goes into that. And I think sometimes we think we're being respectful. We're not always, but I think the sentiment holds true. I think that the group does need to be, your gaming group, the people you're a part of, it does need to be about acceptance, about giving folks a space to be them and be themselves, and have a good time. Again, this is a hobby. This is something where I truly think, and I think we said this a couple of weeks ago, one of our first episodes on Geek Spiel on Air, which is, why did we choose an online format? Well, the original part of gaming, of tabletop gaming, was to sit around a table and connect with people. And I think that, acceptance goes a long way into feeling that you're connected with the crew. And so I think that if you're going to kind of approach those conversations of I want to get to know people, I want to learn people, and I want to be able to facilitate a great time for them, I think I hope that you have a wonderful table to play at and to be an inclusive space. So that's my last minute thought, but that's all I have. So I think that that's a wrap for us. So thanks for, thank you to Matt, Gil, who are some of our regulars, of course. Jim, our guest for tonight, come joining us. And Chris back from the mothership, and myself, thank you. Have a wonderful night. We'll see you next week.